All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we are exploring the fascinating and honestly highly mathematical realities of labor economics. Specifically, we're looking at how these massive macroeconomic forces connect directly to something you interact with every single week, what you pay at the checkout counter. Now, we constantly hear about immigration as a political talking point, right? But today, we're totally stripping all of that away. We're just going to look purely at the numbers, the supply chain, and the underlying economic forces.
It's absolutely a question on everyone's mind right now. And to answer it impartially, we are going to look strictly at the data, the historical precedents, and the mechanics of the agricultural supply chain itself. How does a shift in federal border policy eventually make its way down to the price of a pint of strawberries or a head of lettuce? Ultimately, it's a story about supply, demand, and the workforce that bridges the gap between the soil and your local supermarket.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the engine of U.S. agriculture, then look at the industry's heavy reliance on immigrant labor, touch on some historical echoes from the 1986 Act, map out our currently shifting labor landscape, and finally bring it all home to the impact on food prices.
Okay, Section 1, the engine of U.S. agriculture, the actual people behind the crops. To really understand the folks behind these crops, let's first establish the sheer scale of the agricultural workforce in the United States. According to data from KFF, there are over 2.6 million people working on agricultural farms in the U.S. today. That is a massive number. Now, that does include self-employed farm operators and their family members, but crucially, and this is the number we really care about today, it also includes about 1 million hired workers. These hired workers are absolutely critical to the nation's food system. Literally, without them, the incredibly labor-intensive sectors like fruit, tree nuts, and specialty crops that are notoriously difficult to automate would essentially just grind to a halt.
Moving right along to Section 2, heavy reliance on immigrant labor. Let's slice up this demographic data. We really need to break down who makes up that vital pool of hired workers, because the divide is striking. 34% are U.S. citizens. Another 18% are non-citizens who have work authorization, like your green card holders. But look at the largest segment. Nearly half the people working in our fields, 47%, are non-citizens without work authorization. I mean, wow. That highlights a massive structural reliance on immigrant labor for our food supply. If you zoom out, nearly 2/3 of all agricultural workers in the U.S. are non-citizen immigrants.
And there's also a stark divide in the actual type of work being done here. Immigrant laborers are overwhelmingly taking on the grueling, climate-exposed field work. We're talking between 74 and 78% of non-citizen immigrants performing the physical crop harvesting, which, as you can imagine, involves routine exposure to extreme heat and really tough physical conditions. By contrast, only about half of U.S. citizen agricultural workers do field work. They lean much more toward indoor jobs in nurseries or packing houses. So the hardest, least automatable jobs, they are overwhelmingly filled by immigrant labor.
All right, Section 3, Historical Echoes, the 1986 Act. How does this industry actually adapt to labor restrictions?
To understand what happens when this crucial labor pool gets restricted, let's take a quick look back at the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. Now, before this act, agricultural growers heavily opposed any sanctions on employers. But in November 1986, President Reagan signed the act into law, which essentially made it illegal to knowingly hire unauthorized immigrants directly. So, what did the agricultural industry do? Well, they simply adapted. After 1986, employers just shifted to indirect hiring through subcontractors. A U.S. citizen subcontractor would agree to provide a specific number of workers for a task, totally shielding the farm itself from liability. It's a fascinating historical workaround that proves just how desperate and inelastic the demand for this labor truly is.
Which brings us to Section 4, a shifting labor landscape. Let's look at the recent decline in the unauthorized workforce.
Fast forward to the present day, and we need to see how modern federal policies are creating a brand new disruption. According to recent Pew Research Center data, the unauthorized immigrant population reached a record peak of 14 million in 2023. To put that 14 million into perspective for our explainer today, these workers make up a massive 24% of all U.S. farming occupations. They are practically embedded into the bedrock of the agricultural economy.
But here is where the dominoes really start falling. That peak, it's now broken. We're actually seeing the first real decline in this population since the 1960s. Why? Well, it's a combination of bipartisan federal policy shifts. During the Biden administration's later months in mid-2024, they stopped accepting asylum applications at the southern border and paused parole programs.
Then, in 2025, the Trump administration increased interior immigration enforcement. The combined result of these shifts is rising deportations and self-deportations. And that is actively shrinking this 14 million person labor pool.
And finally, Section 5, the impact on food prices, following the thread from the farm straight to the checkout counter. So, what's the so what for you and me? What happens when this crucial labor pool starts shrinking, but our demand for food stays exactly the same? As Mark Hugo Lopez from the Pew Research Center points out, having fewer workers available to harvest crops translates directly down the supply chain. The domino effect here is incredibly straightforward. Fewer unauthorized immigrants means fewer hands available to actually pick the specialty crops, the fruits, and the vegetables. When farms struggle to harvest their yields, the total supply drops. And basic economics, right? When supply drops but consumer demand stays the same, it squeezes the agricultural supply chain and ultimately drives up the prices you end up paying at the grocery store.
So, the core tension is undeniable. The U.S. agricultural industry relies on almost half of its hired workforce being unauthorized non-citizens, specifically to do the hardest, most grueling field labor. As changing federal policies continue to aggressively reshape who is available to work, can the U.S. food supply chain adapt, or will every single consumer eventually feel the economic impact sitting right there on their dinner table? It's a fascinating economic reality and definitely something to chew on the next time you're pushing your cart down the produce aisle.